Hello. Thank you for joining us on the occasion of Somerset House Studios' Grounding Practice, a year-round series convening creative practitioners and critical thinkers to share methodologies, tools, and experiences for creating and learning, in conjunction with Amplify Digital Arts Initiative. I am Eleni Ikoniadou. I am a reader in digital culture and sonic arts at the Royal College of Art. And my research pays particular attention to sound, voice, and rhythm. And I write and make work on these ideas individually and as a member of the art group Audint. And I am very happy to be in conversation with Nkisi. Nkisi is the alias for Melika Ngombe Kolongo, a London-based electronic musician, producer, and artist. Nkisi produces intense, powerful club tracks equally influenced by African polyrhythms, hardcore techno, and 70s Italian horror films. She's one of the co-founders of Non Worldwide, a collective of experimental artists from across the African diaspora. Nkisi's full-length debut, 7 Directions, was released on Week in 2019 to critical acclaim. In 2020, her new label, Initiation, emerges with INT 001, a 3-track EP melting rhythmic noise strategies with secret drum languages from ancient Congo traditions. She is a fierce DJ who channels 160 BPM kick drums, metallic, hectic percussions, and hypnotizes the dance floor into a ritualistic, transcendental space. Welcome, Nkisi.
Hi.
Melika, welcome. It's really
Thanks for having me.
It's really lovely to be in conversation with you. I've been following your work for ages and ages, and I can see why they brought us together.
Yes.
I think our worlds cross because of our interest in sound and music and rhythm, but also in how we approach these, I think, by focusing predominantly on the unknown, the unspeakable, the uncertain dimensions, and trying to find ways of tapping into that beyond the limits of language. Exactly. Would you like to say something about that from your perspective, about your approach?
Yeah, exactly. I think in my practice, I'm very interested in kind of stepping away from the known. So really going towards the unknown. I think a lot about, or like in the more kind of like scientific way of thinking about sound and like the world and the universe, and that everything is vibration. If you think that our eyes can only see a limited amount of the vibrations that are around us, it gives us also the opportunity to then see that there's so much like untapped potentiality that we can tune into. So that's why for me, thinking about sound as like a way to approach the unknown, also because it's one of these mediums that is just there without really being there. It's like an invisible force. It can take over the whole space. It can really like break structures of time and space, and yeah, really connect with multiple people, multiple cultures outside of like language, but also it can touch, or like that's what I'm really interested in, the fact that it can really touch on the emotional body of people, because I think that's how we actually connect. I always say that, like, you know, music is really about the heart chakra. So it's really about how we can tune and tap into these things, but then also the connection on a vertical way with like the cosmos, and how the way how we even interact with the cosmos is sound. So yeah, there's many things.
Yeah, I think there's something very specific to music and sound in relation to the. I mean, that's the interesting thing there. That there's things that cannot be spoken. This unspeakable, that you also mentioned before, and
yes.
It's things that cannot be spoken of, or how do you? Some things are either too traumatic to speak of, or unknowable. We don't even know how to approach them and speak about them. And I think that's what's interesting in your practice and in your approach in rhythm, because you do this with your fierce use of rhythm.
Yes.
I remember a sonic lecture at the Chisenhale, which felt like a response almost to I felt like my book on rhythm and your lecture were talking right then and there, and I thought you probably didn't know my work then.
Yeah, I did know, actually. Actually, yeah. I think when I came on to even just the title, the rhythmic event, was like so inspiring. And I think I just directly dived into it. So it was really, and that's also the thing that's been really nice actually in this kind of thinking about medium and thinking about method, that like sound became this really nice way where, you know, not all the work only happens in the studio and when I'm in front of the machine. So it can also happen with actually encountering like ideas and theory and like concepts and, you know, like, and that's also something that I'm really interested in like the connection maybe with more like, I guess, what they call like academic thinking, with like how then it can be expressed in music, and maybe then music can also become this more approachable way to actually like bring these ideas to like a wider audience. So for me specifically, I'm very interested in thinking about young people. I feel like a lot of times they are the ones who are kind of like overlooked, and there's not really like room for them to like enjoy ideas really outside of like norms.
So visibility and invisibility are at the core of your practice in some way. Exactly.
But also like, and then at the other side also thinking about how this like coming together and this like collective space that can be created through, you know, and that's also why I'm like very obsessed with rhythm, just thinking about all these people together, you know, me playing a certain rhythm or like being in a certain rhythmic environment, and then how, it's like rhythmic entrainment, how like all the heartbeats can kind of start sinking in, and then what happens, you know? And that's, I think it's like I'm really interested in this like in-between spaces before something kind of like transmutes into something else. Also more thinking about how a way to also deal with these like dominant structures of like knowledge or like dominant ideas is also sometimes actually stepping away from like legibility and rationality and actually more going towards the abstract and maybe even like the weird and like, you know, really experimenting with like things that might not seem to fit together. And that's been something that I've enjoyed doing a lot like recently, is just like really thinking even with like inspiration, references, just really just like more this idea of like clashing things together and then seeing what happens.
Yeah,
you know?
Which is very, very much against the Western idea of, or the Western methods and the Western ways of thinking about the world and of knowledge production. So it's a different way of producing knowledge through music, through sound, through rhythm that does not belong necessarily to that realm of the rational.
Exactly.
Because I suppose the problem is also pitting the rational against the irrational, but rhythm does something else, isn't it? That connects them somehow in an interesting way. It's in between.
Exactly, and I think, and that was maybe really important also in my rhythmic research, to think about, you know, and that's why this idea of like also really thinking about the body and how the body reacts to the music, because there's really this interaction also with, you know, it goes as far as like, it's not just, you know, we're like in this space of music and we're dancing or not, or we're having this like internal, external kind of experience. It's also every cell in our bodies is getting information at the exact same time. So it's like the complexity, and that's also why I say sometimes it's like, you know, even thinking about technology and thinking about what we can do with technology at this point in this world. It's like sometimes we do forget that maybe one of the most complex technologies, you know, are our vehicles. And I feel like sound is like one of the places where this kind of interaction can become really interesting to think about what's possible.
I introduced you mentioning, you know, how you hypnotize the dance floor into a ritualistic transcendental space, and that's definitely what I felt when I just listened and watched some of your latest improvisations, your improv session for Savvy Contemporary last December, and the one you did for Fact, set amongst these dramatic rocks in northern Italy at Roncino Quarry, I think. Yes. And I was immersed into this kind of ceremonial aspect of your performance and of your practice, the scenery also making it much more dramatic, but also the way that you use sounds and the way that you know bending and folding rhythms, and it felt like you were making connections between time and space that maybe weren't there before, like you said before, time stops. And I think it's interesting what your use of rhythm and sound does to our understanding of our perception of time, because it's not one thing. It's not this kind of metric chronological time necessarily only that we abide by. And you were emerging as a shaman in this field, and also maybe making connections between peoples. And I'm interested to hear a little bit more about that, especially because maybe of your recent trip. I think that you've been this life-changing experience, the Voodoo Festival. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that and the connections between time and space and peoples outside of this kind of historical record.
Yeah, it was such a life-changing trip. So I spent some time in Uida. That's like the specific place where the Voodoo Festival happens, like once a year on the 10th of January, as a way to like bless the year that's coming. And obviously a lot of like my research, or obviously a lot of like my interest from before was connected to obviously like voodoo, and I read a lot of literature, or like looked a lot at like the rituals there, because of also this connection with sound and music. And definitely if you think about the Haitian revolution, that was mostly also connected to that's kind of the secret dimension, or the one that's not spoken about a lot, is that it was one that was really connected to sound and music. The interesting part that happened there was this kind of duality of like the same history, because you have like the slave route. Obviously Uida is like one of the places, one of the 5 doors of no return on the continent, and I think Uida is like the first one. So it's also like the first one where the Catholic Church kind of like the Portuguese settlement kind of like started, which is quite interesting, because you have like the first Catholic Church just in front of the Piton temple. And the Piton is this like really important figure in Vodou. Ndombala is the divinity. But also, and going back to like time, also this idea that, we spend a lot of time just waiting for things to happen. And I was trying to like kind of look at the events from like another perspective. And it would be like the small changes in like the fire that's like burning, and suddenly you have like the little, I call them like the fire entities kind of like jumping out. And then suddenly people would start dancing, and suddenly the ritual would start. So it would be these like really amazing, like very subtle transitions that would go from one place to another. Or in the Zangbeto village, it would start with the kids playing the rhythms, and then they would just be dancing, like they're just playing. And before you know, like the kind of teenage kids come and they take over. And then before you know it, the Zangbetos are there, and and you're like, oh, how did we actually come from one moment to another?
I wanted to unpack that a little bit, because that idea of all bodies in a space together, right? Which is like, it's also the club experience that you, of course, are part of in the dance culture, but it's in a different level, in a spiritual level, in a ceremonial level, in the Voodoo Festival, and in all these different rituals that we're talking about. And something about these bodies, you mentioned before, putting bodies in the same rhythm, as the impact of the rhythm is the same in the space and the bodies that experience it. And I know that you are also interested in Fred Moten's, as I am, is another connection that we have.
Yes.
Ideas of the joy and tumultuousness of kind of physically existing in a space. And Fred Moten talks about bodies being in close proximity, which is exactly what you described now, and what happens when you have all these people in the space, and the power that emanates, but also the different type of knowledge that it holds, the bodily knowledge. That is different from the Western model that we talked about before.
because a lot of my research also goes into, and that's kind of what I'm focusing on the label also, this idea of initiation. And in a lot of initiation practices, because I would love also to kind of expand my research and to really focus on ancient traditions all over the world. And it's really interesting even, you know, even like looking a little bit around, a lot of times these initiation practices are always connected to a form of like musical sonic dance. And it becomes really interesting to look at them also as like, a lot of the dances are, you know, the feet stomping on the floor. So it's also this idea of like, you know, like what happens when our feet stomp on the floor, this idea of like, obviously like rooting to the earth, but also who knows what, you know, what this vibration by stomping on the earth, maybe like some knowledge is getting, you know, like
it triggers it.
Exactly, and even if you think in more the esoteric kind of ideas of like the Kundalini, it's also this idea going back then to the snake, also to the Piton. So that's also like a connection, is like also again of like, you know, this like energy coming from down there and kind of going up and then connecting to like a virtual way. So it becomes interesting because it's also like how can we actually look at a lot of these like knowledges that have been put aside, because it's also been one of the strategies of like capitalism to like focus on this like objective, like separating, you know, like science from maybe like more spiritual practices. If you think about, you know, like the witch hunt that happened, you know, this side of the world and everywhere. So it's also really interesting that like a lot of knowledges that also come from ancient traditions that were linked to, ancient traditions that were linked to sonic traditions, that they were kind of put aside. And that's like what I'm kind of thinking or kind of questioning is like, why is it so important to keep music in an entertainment setting where it just becomes this thing of like pleasure? You know, we work from Monday till Friday, we just go have a dance and then, you know, music, or like we listen to it when we come home just to like, obviously there's also something important about this maybe like self-healing aspect and like this idea that you can get like this rest or also just get like ideas from like epiphanies of listening to music, which I think is also a really important part of the musical experience. But still, it's this kind of things that are separated, right?
Yes, exactly. And you mentioned the voice before, and I was thinking, you know, the voice as a portal. You mentioned it as a, and you use voice in your practice. And I wanted to hear a bit more about how you use voice, but also in relation to what you just said, voices, you know, fugitive voices, that Fred Moten would say. But what happens to these excluded voices, right? You mentioned this excluded musicality. Often there were female voices as well that were excluded. And I'm interested in the lament and lamentation and, you know, female voices that are excluded from every other part of society, but only allowed to accompany the dead to the resting place and only allowed to speak then. And the power of that voice that kind of opens up a portal, in this case of, you know, the final portal in the afterlife and the afterworld. Voice as a portal in your practice, because you use your voice as well. Yes,
it's been interesting because I think my kind of early musical kind of interaction has been obviously, you know, and that becomes also interesting thinking about, you know, like the feminine in music. So I always, you know, from being young and kind of connecting to maybe bands or being around people that were making music, I only felt like the only thing that I could do was to maybe like sing in a band or something. So I kind of had that experience a bit. So then the beginning of like my kind of like really getting into electronic music was kind of like rejecting that, was really rejecting, and like I'm just, you know, like the voice becomes this machine, or even if the voice would be there but very minimal. It's been really interesting to feel like it's actually coming back. So
it's also in relation to the voice as a portal and the unspeakable, what we talked about before, that which cannot be spoken. But there is also a balance, and I know that you're interested in, or I think maybe you can tell us that you're interested in the kind of grey area in between what cannot be spoken or should not be spoken, and what you don't want to speak of. You know, what should remain opaque. We talked about opacity.
Exactly.
Glissant and the right to not speak.
Exactly. I think it's I think that side is definitely really important, like in the work, and something that I'm really trying to like push forward, because that's maybe something that I've also really saw in when I went to like the Voodoo Festival and saw the rituals.
In relation to improvisation, which is your method and your technique, many of the times you do a lot of improvised sessions and you use improvisation. In dance, you know, improvisation is a method for asking questions, such as where do words and movement come from, and how do they relate to each other, how do they inform each other, and particularly the problems of not knowing what to say, and also the fear of not making sense, and the question of how to transition between moving and speaking. I'm thinking of the practice of the improvised practice of the brilliant choreographer and dancer Seke Ngwende, for example. And I was wondering what it is for you in music and in sound that improvisation can connect to and tap into and bring out, that can only happen with improvisation.
Exactly. I think for me, like improvisation has come to the point where it has become my main way of like being able to source ideas, because a lot of also the work of thinking about deconditioning and a decolonial practice is also really then understanding also, you know, it comes from both sides. It's like doing the practice, but then part of it is also understanding that I am conditioned and I am, you know, inherently like educated in like this colonial mindset. So then it becomes like the only way how I can actually like disconnect from that.
Yeah.
And then I guess connecting more with this idea of like maybe more also like a spiritual practice that becomes this improvisation. It can go both sides. It can go that like I receive information that is then transmitted through music, or sometimes that it can even be that like if things are right and there is like enough space and energy for me to like open up, then it's like, who knows, maybe it's even a form of like possession where maybe something else can come and like have a conversation and, you know, have something to say.
Yeah.
Because that's also why for me, like even using Nkisi as like the name was like so important, because the Nkisi as like, you know, it's this beautiful sculpture. It is there. It's like this like material thing, but its importance is in its like spiritual side.
Yeah.
And it's really this idea that like, even the story of the Nkisi could be that, you know, in a lot of these traditions, we think about like reincarnation. So it's like, if there's like a spirit before it can actually like find the body that it wants to have, it's kind of just like waits there. It's just like, okay.
Wandering
if there's someone then like, oh yeah, maybe I want you. Okay, I'll just come down now. Or like, you know, when they're waiting around to just be like, okay, now it's my time to sort things out.
Yes.
So it's also this thing of like, you know, the importance of also like kind of like being a vessel for things outside of myself.
Yeah.
And I feel, and then it kind of also connects with purpose, where it's just like, you know, because a lot of times, and I feel that's probably what a lot of artists deal with, is like, why do we do this, you know?
Yeah.
And I feel like for me, it's become that more. It's just like the why I do it is because I feel I have to, but also I feel like that's, that's like the only way how I can kind of connect with these ideas, but then also understanding that, you know, and that's maybe where storytelling comes in, that, you know, and that's maybe also then goes back to, you know, this kind of dynamic conversation between what can be like this higher realm, or like what I like to think also that maybe it's just me from the future, you know, that comes and just like tells me like, you made this track, like, like
definitely this non-linear, non-chronological.
It's just like me, like
time.
communicating with me, but like somewhere else, maybe like in another life or maybe past life, because that's the thing, is like the past could also be the future, right?
Yes. I wanted to refer to the set that we just saw and your relationship to the sound and technology, as we just talked about, which is more on an equal basis and non-hierarchical. And I wonder if you can say something about how does this, you know, idea of sound and your connection with it in relation to pleasure, also repair, a form of healing that you mentioned before. How does it translate practically in the making of music for you?
I think it translates in how important, certainly if I do a set and there's like bodies around and there's people around, it's like how do I put myself in a situation that I really connect with the energy of the people. But then, like you said, this relationship with the gear is that every gear is like a friend and every gear has its like personality, and to really more think about how to bring the personality out. So without too much, you know, where it becomes like this like dance, like kind of like energetic dance where I'm not like too much like leaning into giving in too much, but also like having the response from the machine. So even like practically it could be that like, say if I work on the drum machine, a lot of it is kind of like pre-recorded because obviously it's like polyrhythmic. Sometimes I have one drum machine, so I have like 8 lines. If I have 2, mostly for shows I have 2, so I have 16. So the rhythms only come to life when I perform them. I could never just like press play and have them. It would just be very chaotic. So it's really just about like whatever I feel in the moment, and if it's like 1 and 8 or if it's like 2 and 5, so that's what it's gonna be. And it's really interesting as a method that I actually like figured out for myself, because obviously it just makes it that I kind of also know what rhythms are in the boxes. Maybe I can kind of connect with that, with just being like, oh yeah, I like this one, or so it's like the sounds are maybe sounds that I like, that I recognize because I know them, but I never know what to clash, and that's like the beauty of polyrhythm.
Yes.
It's like, and certainly on the grid, because it's like how to make something that's a bit more deconstructed on a machine that just goes bam, 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 bam. So it's
And
really, and it works, but it's because of the dynamic of the different rhythms and how they pull and push each other, and then like how this role can just like amplify. And sometimes, which is really interesting, sometimes because I'm also really interested in this idea of like when you layer up different things together, you create this kind of like excess noise, and even that sometimes can become a rhythm or like this like little cushion that will also like influence everything else.
That's a really good ending point. I really look forward to listening to the album. Good luck with making it. Thank you very much for talking. So you've joined me, Eleni Ikoniadou, and Melika, aka Nkisi, for a conversation about her practice, her critical methodologies, and our overlapping words and desires to bring out the unpredictable, to tap into the unknown through rhythm, sound, and music. Thank you so much. It's been brilliant to talk to you, and thank you very much, Somerset House, for this fantastic conversation. And please follow on social media for upcoming events for the year-round series, Grounding Practice. Thank you.